Well, thank you all so much for joining us for Space Travel's Effects on Health. As humans dream of pushing the frontier of space, the question remains, how do we protect the universe's only known sentient life? Space travel and its effects on astronauts have been studied since the earliest days of NASA, and there are many risks for which to prepare. Join this presentation about space's effects on the human body and mind, and consider how far can we really go. So this presentation is led by Amanda Thompson, who's a volunteer for the Solar System Ambassador Program through NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She is also a local high school earth science teacher and a lover of all things space. And she's previously presented, I believe, twice to the Tewksbury Library. So all 40 of us, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Amanda for joining us here this morning. And Amanda, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It looks like some of my earlier slides have already been addressed. Just in terms of housekeeping, this is actually no longer necessary to mute your mics. I did want to clarify that this is designed for all ages. So there will be some things that are explained in a more general manner, just so that everyone can access the information. So all ages and information levels. But also there will be some things in there that we'll touch on a higher level. I will go ahead and throw out there that biology is not my level of expertise. I took on this topic as a challenge to myself. Often I do planetary science related topics about Mars, Pluto, comets, things like that. But I wanted to learn a little bit more about the effects of health and spaceflight on human bodies. And so there may be some questions that I can't answer, but there will be a Q&A session at the end. But I'm hoping that I at least open up some interesting questions for you all to either ask me and I'll do what I can, or for you to research a little bit later on your own, that I kind of prompt some questions for you. Robert already covered this for me, who I am. I am a solar system ambassador, and I do teach high school at a local Massachusetts high school. I'm actually teaching an astronomy class next year as well, in addition to teaching Planet Earth class. So if you'll forgive me for a moment, I have a very frantic cat on my table. One of the joys of Zooming from home, but let's go ahead and get started. One of the things that we sort of need to start off with in this talk is space travel has all kinds of contexts about which we can speak. You know, is it worth it? Is it necessary? Why go if it's so dangerous, which is one of the takeaways from this talk is going to be, yeah, it's dangerous to go to space. So why do we do it? So we have to sort of start off with the idea that we've decided to go to space, and it's a worthwhile pursuit. And hopefully if you're here, you are along those lines. But I thought starting off with some quotes from astronauts and people who study space for a living would be a good way to just remind ourselves that one of the reasons we go is because humans are inherently curious, and they always want to know the answers to more. What's the next thing we can learn? So this quote is from Gene Cernan, one of the original Apollo astronauts. And I won't read it out loud to you, just because I know that that might get repetitive for some of you. But just curiosity is the essence of human existence. I also really like this quote from Bill Nye. You may remember Bill Nye, the science guy. He's actually now the head of the Planetary Society, which does some civilian space program, not necessarily with people, but with discovering what we can accomplish with things like propulsion with tiny cube satellites, or using giant mylar light sails to propel ourselves in orbit. So little small things tackling the question of space. But I really like his quote about that really what we get out of space is solving problems, which we've had to solve quite a few, and that it really gives everyone a sense of optimism. We haven't explored nearly everything on Earth, and certainly there are things here worth um, time and effort and resources. But that doesn't mean that it has to be exclusively planet bound. So that's just sort of what I wanted to start out with on my talk. In terms of human bodies in space, there is a part of NASA called the Human Research Program, and their job since the Apollo days, even till now, has been to identify some of the biggest risks and hazards for humans in space. When we first sent astronauts up on the original Mercury programs, the program that was one man in space, and it was all men at the time, and what would happen to them if we put them in space. They originally had no idea if they'd be able to breathe, if they could talk, if they might spontaneously explode, if they were put into space. They had no idea. And so everything from the first launches into space has been a calculated risk. But as we continue to explore and spend more time in space, they've identified 5 primary risks that they need to study and deal with. And so they have a very great, NASA loves to give, I'm blanking on the mnemonic devices, or it's not anagrams. I'm so sorry. I'm blanking on what it is when you give, like HRP is for Human Research Program, but this one is called RIDGE. So number 1, and this is a big hazard to deal with, is radiation. We'll talk about each of these more in turn as we go. So radiation, isolation and confinement, which interestingly is the one that you all, after 2.5 years plus of lockdown, quarantine, COVID, can probably identify with the best, is certainly an issue. Distance from Earth, where you are, whether it's Earth orbit, the moon, Mars, deep space, that actually changes the equation of your risk. Gravity fields, again, kind of ties into distance from Earth, but how much gravity you're experiencing can affect how your body moves fluids or bears weight. And hostile closed environments, which sounds really ominous, but really is just how healthy can you keep your enclosed space? Imagine for yourself, how clean is my house at all times? What if I only could live in this space for a year and could never leave it? Clean and tidy and safe is it really? So we'll again talk about each of these. So starting with radiation, there are 3 primary sources of radiation in space. Just to start off with, on Earth, we are protected from a lot of space's radiation because of our atmosphere. And our magnetosphere as well, our magnetic field around the planet, helps protect us from some of the higher energy radiation sent out by black holes, supernovas, other stars. Space is full of energy, and the higher energy it is, the harder it is for it to actually get through our atmosphere, which is great. But when you're in space, you leave that protection behind. So the 3 main sources you deal with in spaceflight are galactic cosmic radiation, which is coming again from those high energy sources like supernovas and black holes, and what we call active galactic nuclei, which means the center of other galaxies are spewing out gamma rays, cosmic rays, high energy radiation at all times, and it's going everywhere. So there's really no way you can avoid it. It's just there. And these galactic cosmic radiation, you just can't protect against. You can try to shield, and we'll talk about that, but it's unavoidable. Another type of radiation in space is trapped radiation that's inside our magnetic field. Again, I talked about how our magnetic field protects us on Earth's surface. When you're in space, especially in low Earth orbit, there are some types of radiation that get trapped and recirculated in our magnetic. It's not quite a bubble. They often refer to it as a donut, or actually 2 donuts. That radiation just sort of gets trapped here, and how we can shield against that. And the last is a little more not predictable, but protectable. Solar energetic particles specifically refers to when our sun sends out solar flares, what kind of energy is coming towards us. Usually it's pretty high energy, and it's easiest to protect from, it says in that picture there, because we get about 7 minutes of warning, because the sun is about 7 to 8 light minutes away. So if that material is traveling at the speed of light, which it's usually pretty close to, we can register a solar flare. The material, the energetic particles are traveling slightly slower than what we see, and so you can warn the astronauts on the space station, for example, to seek shelter. The reason these three types of radiation are so dangerous is as they travel through space, they lose their electrons. If you aren't familiar with atoms, you've got a proton and neutron, you've got your nucleus, and then you've got your electrons going around that atom. And in this case, things are moving so quickly through space that their electrons are stripped off and the radiation becomes what we call ionized. So what is ionized radiation? We know that means the electrons are stripped off. It also means that it's able to pass through material deeper than non-ionizing radiation. So things like UV rays or X-rays, those are non-ionized, unionized radiation. And they are things that you can shield against with, in some cases, a piece of paper is enough to stop them. In some cases, it's why you wear sunscreen. Summertime, everybody wears sunscreen to help protect yourself against ultraviolet rays. But ionized radiation, we're talking about things that are often called alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma rays, which you can see in the picture on the right here shows you that depending on the energy of the particle, alpha particles have the lowest energy of that grouping, and gamma rays have the highest. They can go into different depths of human tissue, human mass. So one of the things we care about is that these ionized radiations are high in energy. And if they're high in energy, that means that when they interact with anything they're passing through, here's the cat I was talking about, when they interact with any matter they're passing through, they often will actually transfer that energy to the matter, so to the cells in my body, and then actually break off parts of my cells and cause tissue damage. So in ionized radiation, we're worried about energy transfer. And so the best thing we can hope for to protect against radiation in space is shielding, because this picture on the right kind of gives you a breakdown of what human systems are affected most by ionized radiation, to sort of focus on the most susceptible things. We've got the longer term concerns, really. We're not looking at radiation poisoning on the realms of Chernobyl or any radiation accidents like Fukushima in the 2011 earthquake in Japan. We're looking at longer term things such as cataract formation in eyes. Eyes are really, really affected in space. We'll talk about that with fluid shift. We're talking about increased cancer risk. If that energy is going in and altering my cells, they're going to try to repair themselves. And they might do it in a way that is a mutation. And if you get enough mutations, if it mutates just the right way, then you're looking at development of cancer. And then you're also looking at damage to the cardiovascular system. Is it affecting how your blood circulates through your body? Are we looking at any sort of damage to your veins or arteries? So ionized radiation, it's kind of unavoidable in most cases, but as I mentioned, we have to deal with it the best we can. So what we do is we improve shielding. I'm going to play this video in a moment. This is from a new space mission that's being created and developed right now called the Orion Space Program. You may or may not have heard about it. It's the successor to Apollo in a way. It uses a lot of components and a lot of ideas that worked for Apollo and expanding them a little bit on a larger scale to go back to the moon and stay there. So they improve their shielding using existing mass. We can monitor things like the sun. We can look at the sun with any of the space missions we have out there that are watching for solar activity, solar flares, and you can warn people on the space station or the moon or even Mars if we have people there someday to give them warning to seek shelter. So this video sort of is going to talk about that. On the Orion spacecraft, they've developed something called HERA. Again, acronyms. That's the word I was looking for. NASA loves its acronyms. So HERA is the Hybrid Electronic Radiation Assessor. It's just the early warning system for when to seek shelter from incoming bursts of radiation. And the key here with shielding is when you are in space, every ounce of mass you take has a price in rocket fuel. If you want to lift it, you have to add fuel to take it into space. Fuel is expensive, fuel is heavy. So the higher mass you take, the higher rocket fuel you have to add, the heavier the spacecraft gets. And there's a limit, really, to what you can lift off of Earth. So it's really important to limit what you take into space. And so this video, I love this. This is actually just a discussion of how they're going to use existing materials on the spacecraft. Things like the scientific experiments, the bags, the anything they can grab to create temporary shelters in the case of things like solar flares. So I'll just sort of let them speak for themselves.
Whew. Holy moly. All right. Hi, my name is Jessica Voss and this is Anne McLean, and we are here today helping the designers of the Orion capsule evaluate the ability to protect their crew from radiation. Radiation, as you know, is really harmful, and so the whole point is for us to get into a really cool little shelter and take all the equipment we have in this capsule and put it over us as best as possible. And we have to make sure it's stowed and that we are safe and we have everything we need in terms of supplies down in this awesome little bay.
All right, so again, taking what they have to make a shelter, temporary or otherwise. Sometimes the solar flares will send energy past for, minutes to hours, and you have to be able to get in there and stay in there. So it's just one way we're trying to protect humans against the radiation of space. The next one I want to talk about is isolation and confinement. The primary focus here for isolation and confinement, and again, this is one a lot of you can probably identify with to some degree, is the isolation and confinement that comes from, what we've been through with COVID over the last few years, what it's like to be cut off, whether physically or even remotely from family and friends, and having to get your medical appointments through telemedicine. So the primary focus here is on the behavioral and mental health of the astronauts. Excuse me. The missions in space we're talking about that really are the norm these days. Even a typical flight to the space station is 3 to 6 months. So we're looking at extended missions in space. We're looking at people in very small living spaces. Right now, the International Space Station is the largest place you could hope to be on a space mission, and it's the equivalent of in size of a 5-bedroom house. So small living space, because a lot of that is taken up with scientific instruments shared with 6 to 9 people at any given time. We're looking at people who are on a limited or repetitive diet. Something they had to discover really early on with the astronauts is if you feed them the same thing over and over and over again, it leads to some grumpy people. And I think that'd be true for any of us. You're looking at long work days. Astronauts do have a 5-day work week, but during that time, they're constantly doing experiments, they're doing spacewalks, they're doing some physical, heavily mentally and physically demanding activities. And so it's important to take all of these into account when we look at how to protect humans and their well-being in space. So just to give you an idea of how much personal space, I mentioned that on the space station, it's the size of about a five-bedroom house. But in terms of your own personal space on the space station, this is about how much you get to call your own.
In this module, we have 4 crew quarters. My crew quarters here, Rick's crew quarters, Mike, and Oleg's crew quarters. Sergei and Misha's crew quarters are in the service module. And this is the crew quarter. It's the size is similar to the old telephone box. These things do not exist, but actually this is the place that I stayed on my first long duration flight 4 years ago. I got to sleep in the same place, and when you open the door, you can get in there. It's it's a little taller than my height, so it's very comfortable. And you can see there's a sleeping bag here, which is very comfortable. Sleeping bag is fixed to the wall so that I don't float away or kick anything. And it's really comfortable to fly and float and sleep in zero gravity. Here I have a computer, 2 computers here. And one is to check the schedule, official emails, procedures, and there's another one, same laptop, but this is for the internet access. And actually, I tweet from this internet terminal. I have a camera here, and also have a headset here. And using this headset, I can call personal calls to the ground, which is very nice to be able to talk with my family and friends after hours and on weekends. Also, using this iPad, I can watch movies and look at the news program that the ground folks.
All right, so that's their space. I know my mother is on this call, and she is claustrophobic, and I can almost feel how much she's like, nope, not for me. I'm never going. I don't know how I would enjoy having to sleep. I mean, I guess standing up is relative in space, but I know that in terms of space, the laptops, everything's crammed into this tiny area. But one of the luxuries they do get on the space station that they wouldn't necessarily on the moon and Mars is he talked about having internet access. And they can call home to their family and friends when they want to. That's not always going to be possible. The further you get from Earth, the longer it takes data to travel. From here to the moon, there's actually about a 1.3 second delay. From if I send a message to the moon, it takes a delay 1.3 seconds to travel there. And then it takes 1.3 seconds to travel back. So even if I were to say hello to you on the moon, it would be 3 seconds at the very least before I got a return hello from you. So I want you to just sit there for a moment and think about how long 3 seconds is if you're having a conversation. It feels like a long time. And when you start talking about going to Mars, the delay in messages can be 7 minutes to 20 minutes when we're at our farthest from Mars. So it's a long delay. This is, just to give you another idea of personal space, this is the Orion spacecraft, the one where they were making the, what's the word I'm looking for? They were making the little habitat, the little protective bunker for radiation. This is the Orion spacecraft that we're developing to go back to the moon. And the Apollo spacecraft took 3 astronauts, 3 in a row, in 3 what we call couches. The Orion spacecraft is planning to take 4 astronauts, and they sort of stack them in this configuration. But the fastest trip to the moon is 3 days. And so imagine that it's only their own personal space is only slightly larger than what's in this photograph. They, for 3 days of travel, have to spend that time together in something the equivalent size of 2 minivans. So you are bumping into each other, elbowing each other. there's really no privacy in this particular situation. You sleep in your couch, your chair, or you just sleep sort of drifting in the spacecraft, but there's not a lot of space. This is that confinement again, how humans can handle being in each other's space for a long time. So there have been some really cool studies done on Earth to try to figure out how humans can handle this amount of confinement, what it does to your mental and behavioral health. And one of my very favorite missions is something called High Seas. The picture here, this is a mission habitat that is on top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. In the background in that picture covered in clouds, you can see Mauna Kea. And they picked this place in Hawaii because it is the closest we can get in Earth geology to being the same as Mars. It's got the same type of rock, which is something called basalt. And so if they wanted to send astronauts out to do samples on the surface here, which they do, they can take samples that are similar to what they'd expect to be dealing with material-wise on Mars. But High Seas has had about 13 missions at this point, and each mission is anywhere from 6 months to a year. And the idea is that about 5 to 6 people will enter this dome, and then they will be sealed off from the world for 6 months to a year. And when they're sealed off, that means they are simulating Mars conditions to the letter. With the exception of the low gravity, the food is delivered this is actually slightly better than you'd expect on Mars. The food is delivered to that shipping container on the right about every 6 months. So whatever they have to eat and they have to deal with. They have computers in there and they can do scientific experiments and they can write emails home, but anything they want to send is on a 20-minute delay. So they send a message to their family saying, "Hi, I really miss you." And that takes 20 minutes to reach their computer. And then it's 20 minutes before you get a response. So that really drives in the idea of the isolation of space. The further you get from home, the further you are from talking to people in real time. So they studied on these High Seas missions, especially the earlier ones, what it was like to be with the same 6 people uninterrupted for a year. And if they ever wanted to leave this habitat, which they did periodically to do experiments, they had to be completely suited up in spacesuits. They had to use airlock procedures. There was no walking around outside that spacecraft to get some fresh air. It was all recycled air, refiltered air, stuff in a spacesuit, which there's a very great podcast I'll recommend at the very end of this talk about something that's called The Habitat. And it's about one of the crews that lived in High Seas and just sort of the psychology and the being together with people and how that played out over the course of the year. The primary mission here is to test isolation and crew dynamics. Can you live with the same people, even a carefully selected crew? Can you do that for 6 months to a year in these highly stressful circumstances? What kind of dynamics do you need to screen for when you're selecting a crew? They actually put in a crew once that was all female and saw if that made a difference. I don't believe they've done an all male crew. But they definitely have tried to put in different mixes of personalities and specialties to see, what is the best things we can screen for to make a robust, compatible crew on these long missions. So High Seas is a great analog for that. Some other things that can be done to combat the isolation and confinement are actually similar to what we've done to handle COVID, especially during the early days of lockdown. In terms of careful crew selection, well, in our case, we were with who was ever in our house at the time or whoever we let into our house. Sleep, this is true for everyone. Quality sleep makes a huge difference for astronauts. They regulate their sleep very carefully. There's something called actigraphy. I'm looking at my notes here. Actigraphy actually assesses and improves their sleep by recording how much they move while they sleep, how much ambient light noise there is. So Astronauts do not sleep privately. They are heavily monitored because a minimum of 6 hours a night is critical for them to be functional and alert on these missions. They also discovered that it's really important to budget in free time for the crew. In the early days of Apollo, the early days of Skylab, and some of the earlier space stations, they tried to cram in every minute full of time with experiments, with tests, with all kinds of things to maximize their time in space. And in the case of Skylab, one of the earlier space stations, they actually had put so much into one day that the crew, there's an urban legend that the crew mutinied and refused to do anything because they just didn't have any free time. More realistically, they provided feedback to mission control that, okay, we can't work that hard and do everything, and we're really grumpy about it. So now astronauts on the space station have 2 days, they have a weekend, and they also have time at the end of their workday to unwind. And so astronauts are kind of encouraged to take up hobbies. They are some of those hobbies include music. They're actually on the space station at this point. There's a saxophone, there's several keyboards, there's some guitars. So music is a really big pastime that astronauts take up in space. Gardening. I don't know if anyone here gardens, but you know some of the benefits of tending to a garden can really provide peace of mind. And in the case of space, it can also provide some variety to your diet. So just in general, hobbies are highly encouraged when they're in space. I know that you can actually use the ham radio. If anyone's a ham radio operator, I also know my dad is on this call. You can actually get a level of license in ham radio that'll allow you to contact the space station and talk to some of the astronauts in their off time. And several astronauts have reported that this is a highlight of some of their days, is just talking to different people on Earth and kind of having another point of contact. The virtual reality piece here, if you've ever used virtual reality VR goggles, they're looking at uses for this to provide astronauts a way to go to a different environment, in a way, to be in a virtual rainforest or a virtual beach or something that will be visually relaxing and hopefully translate to physical relaxation as well. So, all right, that brings us to number 3. So far we've talked about the radiation in space, which no matter where you go is going to be a factor. We've talked about the isolation and confinement. Certainly the further you get from space, the more isolated and confined you are because you have less interaction with home, less space to work with. The distance from space or distance from Earth also is really important in terms of handling medical emergencies. So that's one of the things I'm going to focus on is the 3 targets and the different medical readiness we have to have. There's low Earth orbit, specifically the International Space Station. There's the moon, and there's Mars. And each location has different radiation exposure, has different amounts of isolation, and has different gravity, which we'll talk about as well. But if we break them down into pieces, the International Space Station, they get resupply every 3 to 4 months. They get new food, they get new supplies, they get new personal items from home, and they can also remove the trash. So there's a lot of in and out of materials on the space station. So if they decide they really want this movie, they can be sent downloads, or they can be sent physical mementos from home, or they can be sent more air, new food, things like that. There's easy communication with mission control and family and friends. There's very little delay since they're only 240 miles above the surface of Earth. And so they can call home once a day, twice a day. When they have free time, they can call family and friends to stay in touch. They have that relatively large space, overall 5-bedroom house, individually, telephone booth sized, shower sized space, but still they can have a private room. And this in medical issues, they can have immediate virtual access to specialists. There are medical emergencies on board. I'm going to talk about one of them in particular, but there are medical emergencies, and they can call experts on Earth for immediate consult. And they can also evacuate to the surface. There's always a capsule right now. It's a Soyuz capsule, one of the Russian capsules that allows humans to go up and down, launch vehicles. And so they have the ability to evacuate if they needed to, but that's like the last ditch. Like, this is a super emergency, because even getting from the space station to Earth to get someone, say they have an appendicitis, their appendix is about to burst. It's 3 hours from the space station to the surface and to surgery. So very fortunately, in fact, they've actually not had any appendix related emergencies or anything super emergent on the space station. They've never had to evacuate, but they do have that option. And because they have the ability to send up more mass, and in space, mass doesn't really matter once it's up there, they can continue to add things to the space station for shielding. So they can sort of keep making advances to improve the ways to protect human health. On the moon, where is that particular? Hold on just one moment, because I'd like to go to my guy who did. Here we go. This is some of the benefits to Earth medicine. I mentioned there was a medical emergency. There was actually an astronaut who developed a blood clot in space on the International Space Station. And the weird part was that blood clot was actually in their jugular vein. If you are familiar with DVT, you may have known somebody who had a DVT. It's a deep vein thrombosis, which is essentially a blood clot. You know that those typically happen in your lower body, in your legs, in your feet, in the lower extremities. But in space, we'll talk about how fluid moves. In this case, the astronaut had a blood clot in their jugular vein in their neck. And they had to figure out, oh my gosh, we've never seen this before on an astronaut. What do we do? So they called in this doctor, Dr. Stephen Mull. He was on Earth at UNC Chapel Hill, and they said, what do we do? Because he's an expert in blood clots. And so he used his expertise and direct access to readings from ultrasounds on the space station to determine, what we should do is we should give him blood thinners. And we don't need to evacuate him. We'll give him blood thinners. So this is similar in some ways to telemedicine that we've developed during COVID, but on a more extreme scale. They determined that they should give him blood thinners all the way up until that astronaut came home. They developed this blood clot 2 months into a 6-month stay, so it would have significantly affected the mission if they'd had to evacuate. And so some of the things we've learned about space travel can translate directly to Earth in terms of remote communities that don't always have access to specialists. Some of these things that we can give remote communities, like portable ultrasound and micro-sized, smaller sized medical equipment that they can then be in touch with specialists to figure out what to do in an emergency without having to mobilize helicopter transport, travel to remote situations. And so there's been a lot of benefits from International Space Station discoveries about medicine that have translated directly to Earth. I'm going to go back for a moment to my moon and Mars. So International Space Station has access to a lot more flexibility in medical emergencies. The moon, not so much. On the right here, this is the logo for Artemis, which is the, if you know anything about Greek mythology, Apollo was the moon missions of the 60s and 70s. Artemis is the newly proposed return to the moon. They're hoping to land on the moon in 2024. And that's with that Orion space capsule that we've seen a couple times in this talk. The gateway here is actually what would be a space station in orbit around the moon. that would be a resupply and a larger area to sort of use as a mission base camp. That's coming up later, but it'll be a way station and logistics support. And the commercial space flight, here we're actually trying to rely on not necessarily NASA, which has a longer wait between launches. They might start to rely on places like SpaceX, Blue Origin, some of the commercial spaceflight endeavors to actually deliver supplies and equipment ahead of arrival. So we can get resupply on the moon, but it's going to be slower. We're talking like a 3-day trip to the moon. So if you want to resupply, you're looking at, you can't do it every day. It's really expensive to launch spacecraft. So you have to sort of do it more. What's the word I'm looking for? I'm so sorry. You have to do it more thoughtfully, what you're sending. And so you're not going to always get what you ask for. I am actually conscious right now that I am getting on the longer side of time. So I'm going to not necessarily zoom through everything, but I'm going to try to prioritize some of the things that are really interesting about specific examples. So I will just—
Amanda, if we go a few minutes past noon, it's not the end of the world.
Okay. All right. That's good to know. I do want to look at Mars for just a moment, because this is the one that people often ask about. Okay, if we're going to go into space and set up a space base somewhere, shouldn't it be Mars? It's similar enough to the Earth in a lot of ways in terms of distance from the sun, in terms of it's about half our size. So if we're going to go there 6 to 9 months away, well, is that something we could manage human life on Mars? If you're going to go to Mars, it's a 6 to 9 month travel just to Mars. You're going to spend about 1 to 2 years on the surface because you're going to make your trip worth it. But that means that you are years away from return. And so what happens to the human body for a long duration mission on Mars? And the answer is quite a lot, which I'm going to talk about in the gravity fields more than anything else. You're looking at a 7 to 20 minute communication delay. So even those emergency specialists that you want to talk to are going to take, you're not going to get immediate answers. It's like when you're waiting for the doctor in the waiting room for them to come back and get you, and you're waiting a really long time before you get your results. You're going to have to be patient, or you're going to have to make autonomous decisions. And so this is where we get into some of the, what kind of medical personnel are you taking to space? Are you taking someone who can put in IVs, who can do ultrasounds, who can do the equivalent of what's an EMT could do? Or are you sending trained specialists or physicians or surgeons? And in the case of Mars, you're probably looking at needing to send more specialized or dedicated medical personnel. And in the case of Mars, evacuation is just unlikely. 6 to 9 months to get back to Earth. Along the way, you're experiencing a lot more radiation. So it's probably not your best option. So Mars is a much more isolated scenario. You got to be able to take care of people on the surface. So what do we need to prepare for? We need to look at the need for trained medical crew. We need to look at the available medical supplies. For example, things like IV saline or blood, blood transfers. I'm sorry. You're looking at, do I have enough blood on the space station to do a surgery? Do I have enough saline to run an IV every day? You're also looking at shelf stability. Like, is this medication going to expire before the mission's over? How is it going to do if it needs to be refrigerated versus not? And you're also going to look at, can I resupply these materials, or do I have to carry everything with me? And so these are all things to consider with distance from Earth. I do want to get to gravity fields, because this one's the most fascinating and we know the most about how it affects human beings. The distance from Earth's surface changes the amount of gravitational pull. You may have heard the term zero gravity. That is not a thing. There is no such thing as zero gravity. When you're on the space station, you are still being pulled on by gravity. But you are in what's called microgravity, which is because you are in perpetual free fall. So the reason that things happen to astronauts on the space station that affect their bodies is not because they're having no gravity. They are constantly falling around the Earth in a circle over and over again. And the container they're in, the space station, is also falling at the same time. And so since you're constantly in free fall, space station tries to go this way, but the Earth tries to pull it this way. And so it splits the difference and ends up in orbit. It means that you're not really touching anything. Everything is falling, including your clothing, including your hair. So you're not touching anything while you're in space unless you purposely go up to it and essentially have to hold on. So in microgravity, things like water behave very strangely. This is water between two paddles. Because there's free fall, that water can bounce up and down. And the astronauts and the fluids within them behave accordingly. And we'll talk about that. The moon is 1/6 Earth's gravity. Mars is 1/3 the Earth's gravity. So anything that's not Earth gravity is going to change the way human bodies and their systems behave. And one of those changes is how gravity affects fluids in human beings. This is on the right. This is that deep vein thrombosis I was talking about, how normally on Earth, all of your body is circulating everything very efficiently through your body because your heart can pump fluids, and fluids under the effect of gravity like to go down much easier than they like to go up. So one of the things that most astronauts experience in space is the fluids in their body start to shift towards their head. They tend to experience stuffiness, vertigo. They feel like they have a head cold the entire time they're up there because of all the fluid in their head, even though they're not actually sick. It changes the shape of your eyeball. The back of your eyeball actually flattens in space. So a lot of astronauts you'll see in conferences, they'll have glasses on, even if they're just reading glasses, because their vision changes under the effects of microgravity. And then, of course, there's the effect of blood clots and how they form and where they form, because fluid is distributing itself differently. There's the effect of gravity on muscles and bones. As soon as astronauts go into space, they lose bone mass almost immediately. And osteoporosis on Earth, you may be familiar with, the idea that your bones get more porous, and that leads you more prone to fractures. It leads you more prone to broken bones and just fragile bones. And astronauts in space, their bodies start to break down bone immediately. And so they lose as much as 1 to 1.5 of their bone density per month. And it actually takes them up to 4 years to replace that lost bone mass. So in space, it's really important that they take medications to combat bone loss, but also exercise regularly to trick their bones into thinking they're still under Earth's gravity. An additional effect of calcium loss from bones is that the calcium actually gets excreted in their urine, which increases your risk of kidney stones. So astronauts on the space station actually have an increased, not even just risk, they have an increased number of kidney stones because of the calcium being flushed out of their body. So what can be done for this? One of the things that they've done is everyone on the space station takes biphosphonate. It's a medication to combat osteoporosis. This picture right here shows the astronaut with his pill card. They have to take those pills once a week. Every week they're up there. Those pills are, if you look at his fingers for scale, they're enormous, but they have to take them to help decrease some of this bone loss. The caption that may be lost in the gray box here: astronauts have to perform ultrasounds of their eyeballs to see, what is happening to the shape of their eye, what's happening to the circulation of blood through their eyes. Are they going to lose vision? Is the blurred vision going to go away? And one other thing that they do to combat these fluid and bone and muscle mass issues is exercise. If you are an astronaut, you can expect to exercise 2 to 3 hours a day on a variety of machines. There's a treadmill, there's weightlifting, there's an exercise bike, but it has no seat. It is just a bike that you hang onto handles and then attach your feet to the bottom. It reminds me a lot of, if anyone has one of those little things you can pedal under your desk, it's like that. It's a teeny tiny exercise bike so that they can get their heart rate going and really work on their cardiovascular system while they're up there. They have compression cuffs to regulate circulation. They actually have some for the neck to help prevent some of that deep vein thrombosis in the neck. If anyone's ever worn compression socks or been to physical therapy where they do compression, they've probably made some advances because of the space station in how to make more comfortable and more effective compression garments. I'm going to skip this video of exercising on the space station just for time, but keep in mind that exercising on the space station is a must. So 6 days a week, 2 to 3 hours a day, you are weightlifting, you are running, you are cycling. All right, the last of the 5 risks in space is hostile closed environment. We need to consider the transmission of viruses and bacteria. We need to look at the temperature. Some people are more sensitive to temperature than most, so they want to find that comfortable temperature to keep people happy. They want to keep the pressure under control so that no one has a stuffy head, but also no one's getting really dehydrated. They want to control light very carefully. They want to control the air very carefully. And they want to keep noise to a minimum so that they can get that high quality sleep I was talking about. So astronauts, before they go into space, are in quarantine. This is actually a picture of the Apollo 11 astronauts after they returned from the moon. They had to be in quarantine for several days after return, just in case they picked up any bacteria on the moon or in the moon dust they brought back with them. So when astronauts go to the space station, they spend 2 to 3 weeks in quarantine. There is no direct contact with anyone who might have germs, bacteria, viruses, anything like that. Because if you take a cold into space, everyone in space is getting that cold. And to help kind of keep track of what's transmitted, they do actually swab and test any cargo they launch before sending supplies up to the space station. It turns out that microbes in space can actually become altered by radiation. So if you had a virus as a kid, that your immune system has developed a response to chickenpox, they actually found that things like chickenpox and older viruses you've had can actually be reactivated in space because your immune system either gets compromised and works less hard, or it gets overstimulated and actually messes with those old viruses more. And so we need to know, okay, in space, can we administer vaccines in space? Do they work the way they're supposed to? And this is astronaut Scott Kelly actually giving himself a flu vaccine on the ISS. He has a twin brother and who gave himself a flu vaccine at the same time on Earth. And they checked both of them for immune response, found that it worked identically in space and on Earth. So that's encouraging that we could actually give vaccines in a space setting. So that's very helpful to know. And habitat management, right? We want to see, is there mold? Is there mildew? Is there bacteria growing on surfaces on the space station just from people breathing? The answer is yes, but not that much because they're limiting how much comes up in the first place, but they do swab the space station and test it periodically. They have very special LED lights that can help simulate Earth light. If anyone has ever had one of those lamps you get in the winter that simulates sunlight to sort of help with mood, this is that idea that you're having special lights that help regulate your mood in space. And some other good factors to keep in mind are good air circulation. Air circulation on the space station is a must. You do not want air hanging out in front of your face because you could just get a buildup of CO2 in a bubble around your face and mouth. That is not good. And you want to make sure you get that uninterrupted sleep. So, in the interest of time, because it is almost 12, I did want to point people to a couple of resources before I finish. There's the Twin Study, which is about Mark and Scott Kelly. I highly recommend. There's some PBS episodes about a year in space. Scott Kelly actually spent a year in space, and his twin brother spent that same time on Earth, and they monitored them to figure out space impacts versus Earth impacts. They found that there are some significant changes, especially with something called telomeres, which change as you age. They actually are the caps on your chromosomes that get shorter as you age. They found that Scott, the one in space, his telomeres actually lengthened in space, which is kind of interesting in terms of aging. The question of is it worth it, that may come up when I open up to Q&A in just a moment. But if there are any of you who are interested in learning more, these are just some suggestions I have for living in space. There's The Habitat. It's a podcast that is about the high seas mission. Endurance is actually Scott Kelly telling about his year in space and beyond. There's always good kids books about living on the space station. And if you haven't read The Martian, it's a fictional book, but it is about what it would be like to use the resources on Mars to survive. And it's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. But I think I'm going to end right at 12:01, thanking the Tewksbury Public Library for inviting me for this talk.
All right, Amanda, wonderful job as expected. And let's see here. Let's see. So folks, if you have any questions or comments for Amanda, please get them into the chat or the Q&A now. And we will take a few questions if you got them. Mike wrote, Top Chef, which is a reality cooking show, recently had a contest with NASA for the chefs to create a new meal for the space station. Not sure if you caught that episode. Naomi enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, Naomi. Let's see. There's still about 40 of us. Anyone have any questions or comments for Amanda before we wrap up?
The Top Chef new meal thing is fascinating. I can't wait to watch that.
All right.
Well, thank you all very much for sticking with me and being here for this talk. I really, really enjoyed having a chance to talk about something new to me. And hope you all maybe have some questions that you'll go look up on your own and find out. And hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Yeah, sounds good. Mike in the chat says, well done. So we'll wrap it here, Amanda, and really want to thank you. I want to thank everyone who joined us. Alicia says, thank you. This was great. So folks, look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey, a link to this recording, and information about some of the other upcoming NASA Solar System Ambassador visits that we're hosting. So thank you all, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Bye, Amanda.
Thank you.